Hey team, we're going to talk about how we can fetch and list out all of our images from our Cloudinary account using Next.js. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and click that little notification bell for future updates. I'm coming at you from Minas Gerais, Brazil. Do I have any Brazilians in the audience? Let me know in the comments. If you're new to Cloudinary, it's a media platform that allows us to do a lot of things with things like images and videos, including both managing those assets as well as delivering them right inside of our web apps. But once we have all those images or assets inside of Cloudinary, there's a lot of things we can do with them, including manage them inside of the Cloudinary UI. But what if we want to create our own custom experience, or what if we wanted to give the capability to our visitors to actually go through and manage these assets themselves? So we're going to learn how we can take all of our images inside of our account and dump them into a Next.js application. And we're going to also be able to select each of our folder so we can actually request the images for each and every one of those. That way we can give a nice browsing experience to whoever is visiting and trying to manage these assets. And like I mentioned, to do that, we're going to use Next.js, which is a React framework that gives us a lot of features out of the box to get us started and actually be able to build this application. Now, to actually get started, we're going to use this demo starter that I created that allows us to just really quickly spin up a new image gallery. That way we don't have to actually build all those components and all the different pieces to the UI in this tutorial. We can get started to learning how we can actually request our images from Cloudinary and put them on the page. If you want to follow along, you can find this link in the description for my demo image list starter, but we're going to go ahead and grab this command, yarn create next app. I'm going to go ahead and paste it right into my terminal, where it's going to go ahead and start creating that new Next.js application, where it's going to pull down this template from GitHub. It's going to then install all the dependencies and basically reset Git history to give us a great starting point. As it's going through, it'll ask you to enter your project name. I'm going to call this my image gallery, if I can spell it right, and it's going to go ahead and finish that installation. But once it's ready, we can cd directly into that image gallery project. Then I can go ahead and run yarn dev, which is going to spin up my local development server. And once we visit this localhost 3000 address that it started up on, we can see that we have our new image gallery down on our local environment. Now, to start off, the first thing I want to do is I want to grab all the images inside of my Cloudinary account, and I just want to dump them in the page. Now, to do that, we're going to use the admin API, which particularly, we want to use the resources endpoint, which is going to give us that ability to basically grab all of our resources. So we can even see with this first request, we have resources / resource type, where I'm going to just scroll down and we can see that we can start to get an idea of what this actually looks like. Or if I scroll down even further, I can see an example of what that looks like, where particularly here we have get all images, where if I go through, we can see exactly the request that it's going to create, where I'm going to reach out to that Cloudinary API and I'm going to specify /resources /image. So to actually do this, I'm going to head into my code and I'm going to head into the source directory and then pages and then index.js, which is going to be our home page. And we can see to start off, this is really a basic page which has a React component, but what I want to do is I want to fetch data, and particularly that's all my image resources. So I'm going to scroll down to the very bottom of this page, and I'm going to specify a new by exporting an async function called get static props, which is going to allow us to get that data at compile time and inject it into our application. And then what's going to happen is we're going to return that data as an object, particularly with the props property, where we're going to have those images that pass it in as props into our app. Now we ultimately need to get that data. So I'm going to create a new constant called results, and I'm going to set that equal to await fetch. We're going to use the fetch API, where we're going to paste in that API endpoint in a second here. But we're also going to start to specify our options, where we're going to need to pass in some headers so that we can add our authorization, which we'll get to in a second. As far as the API endpoint is concerned, we want to grab this api.cloudinary.com and the rest of this actual endpoint. And for now, we're going to skip over the API key and secret because we're going to pass that in as our authorization header, but we're going to head over to our app. I'm going to go ahead and paste it in there inside of fetch and make sure to add HTTPS at the front of that. And instead of having this cloud name as is like that, we're going to add that dynamically. Particularly, we're going to use an environment variable, where we're going to pass in process.env.cloudinary cloud name. And as we can see, because we're trying to use interpolation, we need to change these to template literals. That way it's going to actually be able to process that dynamically. Now, of course, in order to be able to use these environment variables, we need to create an environment variable file. So I'm going to first copy that name, but inside of the root of our project, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call that .env.local, which is the convention for Next.js environment variables. I'm going to paste in that variable name. I'm going to set it equal to my cloud name, which in my instance is Colby Demo, which I'll show you how to find that in a second. But once we're actually inside of our Cloudinary account, we should be able to see where we have our cloud name right at the top. And as we'll see in a second, this is also where you can grab your API key and API secret. Now, just as a quick warning, make sure to use your own cloud name as this account is limited. It's just for demo purposes, as it says there. So make sure that you set up your own free account so that you can actually get all the free credit that you can. But as I mentioned, while we're in here, let's set up our other actual environment variables just so we have them ready when we're doing our authentication next. So let's say Cloudinary API key equals a value and Cloudinary API secret is another value, where then I can go ahead and copy my API key and paste that right into the environment variable value, as well as copy my API secret, which I can just use this handy copy to clipboard link, which will as well allow me to just simply paste it right into this environment variable. So we have our Cloudinary cloud name as our environment variable inside of this API endpoint, but next we also need to authorize this, as because we're using the admin API, we need to make sure that any request to this endpoint is actually going to be permitted. Now, this endpoint uses basic authentication, where we can see if we're using curl, we can actually paste it in right before that @ symbol, but we're going to do it through the fetch API, so we need to set it as a header. Now, the way that we're going to do that is we're going to create a dynamic string for this authorization header, where we're going to add the word basic at the very front, and then we're going to dynamically create a string, which we're going to also encode to base64 that we're going to pass in as this header. Now to start, let's use interpolation, where we're going to pass in process.env.cloudinary API key, and we're going to add a plus sign and then the colon symbol, and then we're going to add process.env.cloudinary API secret. But as I mentioned, we also need to convert this to base64. So we're going to use something called buffer, where we're going to be able to convert it into that right inside of our header. So we're going to go ahead and wrap this value with buffer with a capital B from with a parenthesis, and then at the ends after the API key secret, we're going to say we want to make this to string, and inside of that argument, we're going to specify base64. So what this is going to do is it's going to take this first value as an argument. It looks like I missed a plus sign there. Make sure that you're concatenating that properly. But it's going to take that as an argument, create a buffer from this string, and it's going to create a base64 base string for us, which will represent our authorization header. Now finally, as just a little handy way to make sure I get my results as JSON, I'm going to also tag on a then, where I'm going to say R to JSON, just as an easy way to represent that. And then I'm going to console log out these results so we can actually see what we're working with. Now, if I reload my page, we can actually look in the web console, and we're not going to be able to see the results inside of there because we're doing this on the node process. But if we look inside of our terminal, we can see that we get all those results right inside, including all the resources. And if we look at the very end, we also get something called a next cursor, which is going to allow us to actually go through different pages of results, since they're not going to send every single result on one request. But importantly, I want the resources. So I'm going to first destructure that resources from my results, where then I'm going to also create a new constant called images, where I'm going to say, I'm going to take all those resources and I'm going to map through each resource, where I'm going to be able to actually create an object of only the data that I need when passing it into the application. Now, some of the things that I'm going to want are things like the asset ID and maybe the width and the height, and of course the secure URL, which we're going to actually be able to use, and we're going to be able to pass all that data into our app. So let's start off with our ID, which we're going to grab our resource asset ID. And then how about for our public ID, we're going to also call that a title. We also want to make sure we grab our image, which is going to be resource.secure URL, and we want to grab our width and our height. We're going to actually pass those in as is, so we can just simply destructure those right from our resource. Now, if you're wondering why this particular format for all of these properties, it's because the default starter that we're using for this application and walkthrough is using all those different names. So we can see here the image title, that's going to be our public ID, where our image ID is going to be that asset ID, as well as the image width, the image height, and the image, which is going to be that URL. But now that we have all those images inside of that array of that constant, we can pass that in as a prop. I'm going to head all the way back up to the top of the page, where inside of my home component, I'm going to create that prop, and let's console log that out to see if it worked. Once the page reloads, we can actually see that our images are starting to show up because we reformatted them to what we're actually expecting in the application. But we can also see that array where we have all of our images with all that data. And we can see if we scroll down, we can see all of them, including the images that I used for one of my previous tutorials. But if we notice, we're only seeing 10 images here, where I have a lot of other images inside of my project that I want to be able to show inside of this gallery. Now, as I mentioned before, we get an additional property in those results response called next cursor, which is what we're going to use to actually get the next page of results. So just to make this available inside of our application to start, let's go ahead and destructure that as next_cursor. But because I like to try to keep the same code style throughout my application, I'm going to actually rename that to camel case for next cursor. But then I'm going to pass that right in as another prop back at the top of the page, right after images. And let's also console log that out, where if we head back over to our application, we can see where if we refresh the page, we can see that we now get that next cursor that we can use for more requests. Now, before we go further, if we're looking at this code that we're using, we want to do something similar, but we want to actually do that inside of the client, inside of the browser. Now, we have two issues. The first one is we don't really want to duplicate code everywhere inside of our application. So maybe we can abstract this. That way we can only specify it once. But we have a second problem. We can't actually use these environment variables for two reasons, again, because one, they're not available in the client because we need to prepend with next public for an actual environment variable that's going to be available in the client. But also we don't want to expose these because these are secret values, particularly the API key and API secret, where we don't want people to know what those values are. So we're going to do two things to fix this. First of all, we're going to abstract all this logic. That way we can make sure that we use the same functions everywhere inside of the application and not have to copy and paste all that code. But then we're going to create a serverless function. That way we can actually make that same request on the client. So to start off, in my source directory, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call that lib. And then inside of that, I'm going to create Cloudinary.js, where I'm going to export a new async function. Let's call this simply search. Now for my search function, I'm going to go ahead and grab these results and I'm going to go ahead and paste that right into that search function, where then I'm going to simply return all those results. Now back at the home page at the very top, I'm going to now import that search function I'm going to go one level up and then back into the lib directory from Cloudinary. But then back inside of get static props, I'm going to replace this entire results request, with my search function, which is going to do the exact same thing. Let's see if this works. And we can see that the page already reloaded, but let's refresh it again just to make sure. And we can see everything is still working as expected. So next, we want to also likely map all this same image data the exact same way. So let's also put this into an abstracted function. So at the bottom of my Cloudinary file, I'm going to export a new function. This one doesn't need to be asynchronous. I'm going to say map image resources, where it's going to take in an argument of resources, where inside I'm going to simply return all of that code that I just copied from the home page. But just like my search function, I'm going to copy that name. I'm going to head over to the top, import that as well. And then I'm going to replace this images code with my map image resources function, where I'm going to simply pass in resources. And yet again, when I refresh the page, everything should still be working just as expected. Now again, we have our abstracted logic, but we can't actually make these requests inside of the client because we're using those environment variables that won't be available inside of the browser. So now let's create a serverless function, an API endpoint, where we can actually make that request. So inside of my pages directory, inside of source pages, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call that API, which is the Next.js convention. And I'm going to create a new file and let's call that search.js. Now, just like any other Next.js serverless function, we're going to export a new default async function called handler, where we're going to get two arguments, where we're going to have our request and our response, where then inside of that, we want to actually run that search request. So I'm going to import my search function from 2 levels up this time, lib Cloudinary, where inside of here, I'm going to create a constant called results, which is going to be equal to await my search function. And then we want to actually respond to this request. So we're going to use the res object, and we're going to first pass a status of 200, where then we're going to respond with JSON, where as those results, we're going to simply spread that out and pass them in as is. Now, because we don't have a mechanism to actually test this out yet, let's use useEffect, which if you're following along, you should have already imported at the top of the homepage. But I'm going to use useEffect, where I'm going to create a new function inside of there. with an empty array as the dependency so that it only runs once, but then I'm going to create a function that I'm going to immediately invoke. It's going to be async. I'm going to call it run. That way we can actually test this out using async await, which is my preferred method of actually using asynchronous request inside of the use effect hook. But then I can say that I want to create my constant of results. I'm going to set that equal to await fetch, where we're going to reach out to our new API endpoint called search. And then I'm going to chain that as a response so I can get the response as JSON like I typically do. Now, once that's completed, let's log out the results just to make sure that it's actually working properly. And if we refresh the page, we can see that we get our results as before, but now we have those additional results. And this is actually going to be the exact same request as we see here, where we can see that these IDs actually align. Now that's because we're actually making the exact same request a second time, but in the browser. Where what we really want to do is we want to pass in this next cursor so it gets the next page of results. Now, if we head back to our documentation for the admin resources endpoint, we can scroll down here and we can see that as we're going through, we see this next cursor, which we're going to append as a URL parameter when we're actually sending this request out to Cloudinary, which is going to have that value that we saw. Now, this is going to work in kind of two steps here, where first we're going to send this data to our API endpoint, and then our API endpoint is going to pass that data to our search function, which actually makes that request. So this kind of happens in two steps. We're going to first post that data to our API endpoint, and then we're going to tag those on inside of our search request as URL parameters, because that's how we actually send that data over to the Cloudinary API. So let's start at the very bottom here with our search function, where I'm going to create a new constant called params, which is going to be an empty object to start, but I'm going to create an argument called options, which I'm going to go ahead and spread out into that params object. That way we can pass in really whatever we want as a param, and we're going to tack it on to this URL. But I want to create a string from these URL parameters. So I'm going to create a new constant called param string. I'm going to set that equal to where I'm going to take each and every one of these params, but I'm going to wrap it in object keys. Because what this is going to do is it's going to grab all these property names that are inside of these parameters so that I can pass them right in as a string. So first, I'm going to have an array of all those properties. I'm going to then use the map functionality where for each one of those keys, I'm going to say that I want to create a new string where the first property of our URL parameter is going to be key, which I'm going to set that equal to the value, which is going to be params key. But because we're actually passing that in a URL, we want to also make sure that we're encoding it. So what I'm going to additionally do is going to specify encode URI component, and I'm going to wrap that around only the value so that that's going to be safe inside of the URL. Now, finally, because we want to actually turn this into a string where we might have multiple parameters, I'm going to finally pass in at the end a join, where I'm going to join each and every one of those with an and. But then once we have this param string, we're going to paste it right in at the very end of this URL, where I'm going to first pass in my question mark to show that it's query parameter strings. And then using my interpolation again, I'm going to pass right in that param string. Now, going a step up to my API endpoint, I want to be able to accept that data so I can turn them into parameters. So the first thing I'm going to do is inside of this handler, my request object is going to have a body, which I can post data to, where I can then parse that body and I can send it into my search request. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a constant called params. I'm going to set that equal to JSON parse my request.body, which is going to turn it into a JSON object. I'm going to simply pass that right into my search function. And then once we go back to where we're actually making that request, I can now create a second argument to that fetch function where I'm going to first pass in my method of post so we can actually send that data. And then I'm going to create that body, which I'm going to use JSON stringify because we actually need to send that as a string in the request, where we're going to pass in that next cursor right into that request. Now, one thing that's tricky here is if you remember, we converted the next underscore cursor to camel case. So we want to make sure that we re-normalize that when we're sending it up to Cloudinary. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to go back to our Cloudinary function, and we're going to say that right after our params here, if options.next cursor, we want to actually update these params. So we're going to say params is next underscore cursor is equal to options.next cursor. And just to clean things up, we can go ahead and use delete params next cursor with the camel case. Now, just in case options is not defined when making that request, we want to make sure we set a default value there. That way it's not going to error out because options is not defined. But once we reload the page, we can see everything is working as expected. But now if we look at the results and we look at that first resource, we can see that it's a different ID. And we can even open up that secure URL and see what that looks like. And we can see that we have Mel, which if we start to scroll through, we do have Mel, but it's a different Mel that we can tell by that asset ID. So now that we actually have this working where we're able to grab the next page, let's go ahead and add a load more button, which is going to allow us to actually provide a UI for somebody that wants to keep triggering more loads of the next page of results. So I'm going to go ahead and underneath my use effect, create a new function called handle load more, where I'm going to make that asynchronous. But inside of that, I'm going to actually copy the same request that I just used because we no longer actually need this use effect function, but we're going to be able to use this when somebody actually clicks the button. Now to actually add that button, I'm going to scroll down and underneath all those images, I'm going to add a new paragraph tag. And because I actually have a component button already imported, I'm going to use that button component. I'm going to say button, where if you just want to use a normal button because you don't have a button component, that's completely fine as well. But I'm going to say load more results. And I'm going to say on click, I want to run that handle on load more function that we actually defined at the top here. It looks like it's handle load more, not handle on load more. So I'm going to go ahead and update that, where now it's going to actually trigger that function. Now, if we remember two things, this search request is handling this exact same way as our search function inside of getStaticProps. So we're going to get the same results and we want to map those same images. So I'm going to copy and paste that snippet up inside of my handle on load more function, where then we're going to be able to have those images that are immediately ready for us to use. Now, because we're going to have new images, we want to be able to update our page so that we have both our original images and our new images. And to do that, we're going to use state. So we're going to use the use state hook, where at the very top, I'm going to create a new constant called images and then set images, where we're going to set that equal to use state. Now we can immediately see that we have a conflict here between the images prop and the images state. So I'm going to rename the prop to default images just so that we can keep those as the nice clean images prop. And I'm going to set that as the default value for use state. I'm going to do the exact same thing with my next cursor for default next cursor. I'm going to pass that in because we're going to want to update that cursor every time we try to request a new page as well. So I'm going to also set next cursor, where now because I have these state variables, I can actually update them, which will update the application. So the first thing is the images. So let's scroll down here and we want to use set images, which because we're currently in the handle load more scope, we can use these images as is. But I'm going to say, I'm going to set the images, I'm going to take the previous ones, and I'm going to return a new array where I'm going to spread out the previous images, but I'm going to also include all the new images. Now, additionally, I want to also include the updated next cursor. Now, because we already have the next cursor in scope because we're using it, that's going to create an issue when we're actually trying to update the new one. So let's rename it this time to updated next cursor, or really whatever you want to use when we're updating the state. But then right below set images, I'm going to also call set next cursor, which I'm going to simply pass in that updated value. Now, finally, as one more thing, when we actually click the button, it's going to actually refresh the page. So we want to make sure we prevent the default action from happening. So I'm going to pass in that E as my event argument. And I'm going to say event prevent default. That way it's not going to try to refresh the page or trigger actual browser functionality. It's only going to make that request for us. But now when I open up the page again and scroll all the way down, I can hit load more results and it's going to use that next cursor to grab the new set of images. Where in my case, I have a bunch of duplicated images because this was for a tutorial, but we can actually see that the IDs are different because these are actually using URLs. But once I get down past that tutorial results, we can start to see that I do get different results. And when I click load more results, we're going to start to see other tutorial images that I was using before. Now, if your account is the type of account that has folders in it, you might have noticed that we're getting all of our images, not just our root images. So we also get the ones with folders. Now, what if we want to separate those out and make sure it's a little bit more clean when we're organizing this, because we probably don't want to show this all at one time? So to do this, we're going to use the folders endpoint, which is going to allow us to grab all those folders, and then we can use those folder values in order to request only the images for that folder. Now to start off, one thing that's tricky about this is we can't use the resources endpoint to do this. We actually need to use the search endpoint. The reason is when we're using the search endpoint, we can pass in what's called an expression where we can specify the exact folder that we want to use. So to start, back inside of our search function inside of libcloudinary.js, I'm going to simply update my resources to resources/search. Now, once I refresh the page, we can see particularly one thing is going to be different to start is we're going to get more results by default. But aside from that, we're going to get the same images that we always got before. It's going to just give us more results that we can load from that first request. But we only want to get the images that aren't inside of a folder. So back inside of the home page, at the very bottom of the page, I'm going to update this first search request where I'm going to include a parameter and I'm going to call it expression, where inside of that expression, I'm going to say that I want my folder to be equal to nothing. Now, if we refresh the page, in my instance, I actually don't have enough images in my root directory where I'm going to be able to use a next cursor. Now, you might have run into this earlier if you didn't have enough images for that 10 images start, but let's go ahead and fix this now. We're back inside of our project. We can say that if we don't have a next cursor, we're just going to say that we're going to specify false. So let's say if we have a next cursor, or we're going to specify false. But that way, when the page reloads, we can see that we do get our 47 images, but then we just don't have a next cursor because we don't have that value. But now let's get those folders on the page so that we can actually use them to request other folders. So looking into the documentation, we're going to simply hit /folders. Now, because we're already abstracting logic here, let's go over to our Cloudinary file. And I'm going to first of all just simply copy and paste this search function, but I'm going to call this get folders, where we can really clean a lot of this out. We don't need any URL parameters for this particular endpoint. We just want to grab our folders. So let's get rid of all the params. We can get rid of them at the end of the URL, but then we also want to update this to, instead of resources search, we're going to say folders. But then we're going to still keep that same authorization and we're going to return the results as is. But now I'm going to grab that get folders. I'm going to head to my home page where the first thing I'm going to do is import that function. And then at the bottom inside of get static props, let's say I want my constant folders to equals await get folders. And just to see if this works, let's first of all console log out my folders. But now if we refresh the page and we look inside of our terminal, we can see that I have my folders here. Now we can see that the top level property is folders. So what I can actually do to start is I can go ahead and find that folders. I'm going to destructure folders, but then I'm going to pass that right through as a new prop. And like usual, I'm going to add that as a prop that I can use inside of my app. And then we're going to be able to use this to actually show all of our folders. Now to do this inside of the UI, I'm going to go ahead and clone this h2 and unordered list, where first I'm going to call that folders, and I'm going to change this to folders as well. And I actually already have a style set up for this. So I'm going to change styles to folders, and then I'm going to go ahead and update everything here where it says image instead of image. I'm going to say that I want to use a folder, but instead of all this inside of here, I'm going to simply create a new button, and I'm going to specify the folder.name inside. Additionally, because we don't have an ID, we have a path, I'm going to specify folder.path as the key. Once the page refreshes, we can see that we now have our folder names. But now what we want to happen is anytime we click one of these folders, we want to store what that folder is, and we want to refresh the results with those files. So to start, I want to first grab that folder path. So I'm going to specify a data attribute on this button where I'm going to say data folder path is equal to my folder path. And then I'm going to create an onClick handler, but I'm going to actually do that on the unordered list. That way I don't create a bunch of new handlers for every single one of those buttons. I'm going to say onClick. I'm going to run a new function called handle on folder click, where under my load more function, I'm going to create a new function called that handle on folder click, where inside I want to set a new state variable for our active folder. So at the top, I'm going to duplicate this state. I'm going to say I want my active folder along with my set active folder. And because we don't have a folder to start, we're going to actually set this as an empty string, which just makes it easier for us when we're creating the value dynamically. So inside of this onFolder click function, I want to first grab the folder path that I'm working with. So I'm going to say constant folder path is equal to event.target, which that target is going to be our button in this instance. Current target would be the unordered list, which has that event handler. But because we specifically click the button, the target is going to be that button. But then we want to grab the dataset folder path, which then we can take that folder path and we can say set active folder to that folder path. Now, additionally, we want to clear out all the other results from the other request. So let's say set next cursor to undefined, and we can also set our images to an empty array. Now, just to make sure this works, let's go ahead and console log out that active folder value. And we can see when the page reloads, we can click these different folders and they're going to set that value. So now let's actually use this value to make a request. Now, the trick here is we want some kind of mechanism so that we can hook on a new request anytime this happens. Now, technically, we could do it inside of the handle on folder click, but I prefer to have something else that's really reactive to the active folder, not just to that click. So I'm going to create a new use effect hook where inside of that hook, my dependency is going to be that active folder value. Now, to go inside of that, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste these results right from the handle on load more function. I'm going to actually copy and paste everything right inside of that use effect hook, but I want to also create that immediately invoked function like I did earlier, where I can say my async function run is going to include all of that code. Now, as I mentioned before, we want to also make sure that we're passing in whatever that folder is. Now, to our search API request, we want to pass in that expression, which is going to be our folder, which we want to set dynamically, and it's going to include those two double quote strings, which inside we want to pass in our interpolated value of our active folder. Now, before we move on, we do want to also do one more thing where we want to use the same expression in our original handle on load more request, because when we're actually paginating, we want to use the exact same expression anytime that we're making this request. That way, this handle on load more is using the same request. It's not using something else. Now, if I refresh the page and I click samples, we can see that the page reloads and I can see all that sample content that comes by default with a new Cloudinary account. And if I click my uploads, similarly, I can see all of my uploads. Now, this is a really great starting point for our asset management. We're really just viewing all of our images, including our root directory images and all of our folders, where we can even navigate inside of our folders. But we can do so much more with the capabilities of the admin API, where really we can actually add the ability to manage all those assets, or really transform those images, or do whatever we want with our images before we actually use them for delivery. Now, if you want to take this a step further, one other thing you can do is at the bottom of the page, we have our load more button, but we're not always going to have more results. Maybe we don't have a lot of images in our root directory, or maybe we just hit the point where we exhausted all of our new pages. We can dynamically set this. Now that we have the search endpoint that we're using, we get an additional property called total results, which we can use to dynamically show this more results button. Additionally, we can do things like add a little copy button where if we want to grab the URL for this image, we can add that so that people can easily copy it when they want to use it. We have a lot of power and capability for asset management by using the default Cloudinary dashboard. But if we want to do something custom or be able to provide a similar experience to our customers or our visitors, we gain the access of being able to use the admin API to do this all within our own application. What's your favorite use case for asset management? Do you want to give your customers the ability to actually upload and manage their own images? Or is this for your actual use case? Let me know in the comments. If you want to take this a step further and learn how you can actually create a mechanism for uploading images to your Cloudinary account, check out my video uploading images to Cloudinary with React and Next.js. Or if you want to start to learn about image transformations, which you can do a lot of cool things like be able to crop an image automatically based on where the face is inside of an actual image, check out my video Generate Thumbnail Images Using Face Detection with Cloudinary. If you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for future updates. Thanks for watching.